Have you ever refused to hear the truth? Have you ever thought that you were right even though you knew you were wrong in the back of your head? Maybe you're a person who likes to take on new things, and you took on just one too many or maybe two too many things, and you're going about your day and you're talking to your friends, and one of your friends is like, "Are you sure you should be taking that on? Don't you feel like you're overcommitted?" And you immediately say, "No. This is my life. I'm a busy person. I'm perfectly fine with taking on more things," even though you know the stress is getting to you and you know it's just one too many things and you just want to keep adding to it. You just don't want to admit it. Maybe your spouse asked you to take out the trash or do a chore, and you promptly forget. And then maybe a few hours later, your spouse comes back and is like, could you take out the trash? Or maybe do the chore that she or he asked you. And you respond, "Of course, I was just going to do that." Even though you knew you completely forgot, and you still forgot, and you still don't admit it. Maybe you didn't turn in your homework. Maybe you have an assignment in your college class, and you come into class, and it's one of the smaller ones, so the professors are asking you why you didn't do your homework. It's not common in college, but maybe, just think for a second. And you decided, instead of doing your homework, you decided you wanted to go to that party, or you wanted to play some video games, or you wanted to go play some sport activity outside. And your teacher asks you, and you said, "Well, I've been really busy at work, and I just couldn't do it," even though you knew that you had the time, and you decided not to do it. And you decided not to admit it in that moment when you were confronted with the truth. The words of Jesus would have challenged these different Jewish beliefs and cultures. In Matthew 5, verses 21 to 22, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." In the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus references many Old Testament laws in this way. The common interpretation he states the common interpretation at the beginning, and then he kind of flips it upside down or adds depth to it. In this example, he says, "You heard that it was said, 'You shall not murder,' and then follows it with, 'But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment.'" He takes the original interpretation of the law and he clarifies it with its real intent. We're hearing it from the authority on the law, that this is actually what this law means. He has come to fulfill the law and not abolish it. That's actually in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. He clarifies that the intent behind the law isn't just don't murder, but it is that any anger towards your brother is treated the same as murder in God's eyes. He calls us to think, and he calls the Jews at the time to think more about the law than just it's an action, but it's a heart posture. It's a heart change. This really upset the Pharisees. Of course, because their culture and their lifestyle was centered around the legal, cut and dry interpretation of the law. They were strict rule followers, and they expected Jesus to come and reinforce that. And clearly, Jesus did not. Very early on in the Sermon on the Mount, he is completely tearing apart that strict interpretation of the law. And he is adding to it. He's bringing depth to it. Their expectation of Jesus was not met, and they denied it. They got angry with it. They got angry with him. They reacted poorly. In chapter 5 of verse 19, Jesus says, "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Now, this section, I feel, specifically challenges the Sadducees' lifestyle. Their perspective was to keep the peace and stick with the norms and just, go with the flow. They expected Jesus to say that the laws are not important and following them isn't the most important thing in the world. They hoped for a liberator of the law. In that verse, Jesus calls us to do just the opposite. He calls them to do just the opposite. He calls us to adhere and teach the full depth of the commandments. The Sadducees' expectations of Jesus were also not met. And they responded also poorly. What about the Zealots? Did Jesus meet their expectations? Nope. They expected Jesus to be their warrior king. They expected him to bring literal, physical victory over their enemies. They had been preparing to fight alongside Jesus. And Jesus says in verse 44, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Jesus speaks of peace rather than fighting. Can you imagine hearing from Jesus? Like, he says the actual opposite of what you have been following and living out in your life. Can you just imagine that? Like, that's tough. Now let's look at the last Jewish group, the Essenes. Their culture was that of isolation and removal from society. They decided to run away from the sin of the world and live their lives separated in prayer and worship, waiting for their Messiah to come and take them. They expected Jesus to come and take them away from it. While Jesus says in chapter 5, verse 16, "Let your light shine before others, so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." If I were an Essene, I'd feel called out. Jesus calls us to share the light and the good news and the goodness of God and his love for us. He doesn't call us to isolate ourselves from the world and share the light amongst ourselves. As you can see from just a few examples, these are very few compared to the whole Sermon on the Mount. That's why we're going to go over it in several weeks. Jesus challenges and challenged the Jewish culture and tested it with all of his words. And their reaction to this, the Jewish reaction to this, they were so threatened by it that they eventually had him killed. That's how threatened they felt. That was their response to being called out as wrong. How do you respond when Jesus challenges your lifestyle or your beliefs?